Hi, and welcome back to the Life in Bomb City podcast. I am Aaron Favor, and I'm joined today with a special guest, Ms. Jackie Kingston.
Good morning.
Yeah, Beth is out today. She has got some prior business to attend to. This is the first time we've done the podcast without Beth, so I'm hoping that the color is still here. Because otherwise it can sound drab. And anyway, Beth does bring the light. So anyway, the idea for today's podcast comes out of the 87th legislative session. I've asked Jackie to come up with her top 5. Originally, the idea was maybe take top 5 and put them with either a hit from the 80s or a hit from the 90s. Because there is a lot of angst in that music, but I think probably it's better not to drag some of those bands into the fray. So
they would prefer it that way,
I think they probably would. So anyway, everything going well?
For me, yes, everything is great. This legislative session, looking particularly at that, and I work at KAMR Local 4. I'm the evening anchor there. I host Studio 4 in the afternoons. But my favorite show that I get to do every week is called Politics Today. And it's my Sunday morning show, 10 a.m. I record it early. I'm not actually in studio at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, thank goodness. But I get to really do a deep dive into issues that affect my viewers and us here on the High Plains, and what politics means to you, to people who are listening to this, to people who watch my newscasts and watch Politics Today. One of my favorite things that I get to do. And so I'm delighted to get to talk about the legislative session, because this is a session, the most recent session that I can remember, that we had the least amount of access because of COVID-19. And so much happened that didn't get a whole lot of press, that didn't make it really into our collective conscience to consider how important it is. And so I am stoked to dive into some of these things with you today.
Awesome. Do you happen to watch these committee meetings as they're going live, being live streamed in the, once coming out of the session themselves?
Aaron, you are overestimating my level of nerdiness in this. Yeah. I don't get to do that. I wish I could, but no, I don't.
Okay, well, that's one of my favorite pastimes, and I don't know why that those meetings drone on and on.
Yes,
and a lot of times the individuals that are in those meetings, I can tell that they're being droned on and on because they're really on their phones, and it's just like in Washington. They've got other things on their mind and other things to attend to, but they also have a prior commitment to this committee meeting, which is an incredibly important part of what they do.
Right.
So, I mean, it's interesting on one hand in the sense that our representatives' committee meetings are so incredibly part of the intricacies of the job. But on the other hand, it's also interesting that they are so long and drab, and particularly because of the testimonies. And by the way, I'm not knocking the testimonies. They're a very important part of a democracy. Sure. Being able to voice them there in the session rather than prior to, or just making sure your voice is heard before the people that are making the decisions.
Right. But
they can become boring, kind of like a lecture. Like I can say this class is really interesting, and I'm sure I've had plenty of students that say, I think he's probably a good person, but
yeah.
I wish that he would reform this lesson or whatever so that he wasn't talking so much. And I think that it's a fair critique to make, but I don't typically try to make critiques about legislative sessions, especially in Texas. We only have them once every 2 years.
Right.
And so I really wouldn't appreciate what we've got.
I want to ask you about those committee meetings this year, as you watch them. Were they different because of COVID? It feels like so media access was different this year because of COVID. Panhandle Days got canceled. We usually go up there as a group, go down there to Austin as a group. The mayor and the Convention and Visitors Council and all these different groups will go down there, and we meet with our legislators, and they are lobbying for things. And I get to go and cover it as a news story, which is super great. This year, because of the regulations that were in place because of COVID, we weren't able to go. The whole thing was canceled. And so I wonder about those committee meetings. Did they look and feel different this time? Were they more reliant on the internet? Were they Zooming people in? How did it go this session?
There weren't Zooming people in so much. I didn't see a lot of that. And from the live stream, I mean, they had everybody obviously situated appropriately with the health standards, but the level of I'm a big believer, and this is going to sound kind of strange, I'm a big believer in closed sessions. And I know they have a lot of those, but I think they should have more, because otherwise it gets our legislatures, it keeps them up there into the dark hours of the evening, into the twilight, and into the early morning. And if we're going to have public testimony and lots of it, and we had a lot to say also, not just with all the social justice things that went on, but with the public health issues that were going on, and everything in between, from businesses being closed to economics and whether or not we're going to accept federal aid, to international trade. Yeah, the international trade was a serious issue with energy, and they had the role that played in the election. And so, I think that those are all valid points, kind of pertaining to the question of whether or not this session was any different. Are the issues the same? Yeah. Was the intensity, and maybe not the saliency, but yeah, the intensity for this year, we'll see if they're salient, I guess. Yeah,
and I think that's an interesting point that you make. These kind of those committee hearings, which again, really important and tune-inable if you happen to have 6 hours on a Tuesday where you can just have it on in the background, where you can be listening for this, or you can go back and watch it. But they tend to be really long and drawn out, because when you get a hot button issue like a social justice movement or the energy grid, when you start talking to people who have been affected by these things dramatically in their day-to-day life, and they say, yes, I want to address my representation in the state legislature and make sure that my voice is heard, my experience matters, they tend to drag on. They tend to take hours and days at a time. And so it's interesting, those rules around what can be said in those meetings and open access in that way. If you're looking for a certain person who has testified in front of these committees, as I have done, checking on people who've run for office and saying that they've testified, if you're looking through, and the legislature has these all on their website, but if you're looking through specific committee meetings and looking for one person's testimony, you got to watch the whole thing. And it's so the access is there, but man, it takes a certain amount of privilege of time to be able to watch those things and to engage in that way.
Yeah, certainly. And there's a big difference between someone who is asked to testify specifically on a very specific issue to convey their experience about a health issue, or their struggle with discrimination or whatever the case may be. And it's different when people want to get up there and just, drone on about, why everything is broken.
Yeah, I agree.
World,
keeping things in topical.
Yes,
every time.
Top 5. We're going to do the high fidelity thing. So high fidelity being a reference to the movie from the John Cusack movie, but they just redid it on Hulu. If you watch the Hulu.
With Zoe Kravitz?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have not watched it.
Okay.
No. And I've probably not seen the movie.
Okay. Okay. With John Cusack. Okay. Well, he has top 5 everything, top 5 records, top 5. And then originally is it Nick Hornsby that wrote the book in the 90s? I think that's what it was. And anyway,
I believe you.
This is one of the first movies that I ever saw Jack Black in. And so it was hysterical. I haven't seen him lately, but I hope he's doing well. So anyway, that being said, though,
he went viral during the pandemic for that video. He did like a video, like a song. It was hilarious. I'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so John Cusack does all these top 5s. He has a record label called Top 5 Records. And without giving anything away from the movie, because I know all of our listeners are going to go out and rent it from the public library. The big thing is, top 5 everything. They have top 5 songs on a day that's rainy, top 5 songs for a funeral, top 5 songs for, when the thermostat's too hot, things like that. So what are the top 5 things that you put down from the legislative session, 87th
legislative session? It's so confusing. Your listeners already know this, but it was a weird year, and the way to talk about the legislative session involving legislators who put forth legislation, we make it as confusing as possible. But I defer to the governor because I could not choose 5 that I felt like I was, and being a journalist, it's important to me to remain non-biased and remain apolitical. And so what I went with are the 5 that the governor has tweeted about, that he has talked about were some of his priorities during the session, that he is most proud of during the session, knowing that we're going into a special session soon. And then I replaced one with another because I think it's topical, pertinent, and especially to us here on the High Plains. And so my top 5 from the governor, which he tweeted on May 31st, so right after the session ended, he tweeted, "This session we passed legislation to secure our border, support our police, expand hashtag 2A rights, Second Amendment rights, defend religious liberty, protect life. It was one of the most conservative sessions our state has ever seen." So Abbott tweeted that. So I'll go with those. Secure the border, support police, as he puts it, expand Second Amendment rights, gun legislation, protect life, and then I'm gonna slide HB 5 in there, which has to do with rural broadband, which I think is really important to our area.
Those are really good. Those are all really good. I was thinking about the broadband the other day. Actually, I set some trail cams out, and I was hoping that the cellular would actually pick up in some of the more rural parts of our state. And I'm not sure that it's gonna work. It's going to be kind of a little bit strained, but it'll be good. Well, it's going to be really good.
I think that HB 5 is particularly interesting because in the last legislative session in 86, I talked with Representative Price about what his priorities were. And he talked a lot about, interestingly, and this is, consider this is 2 years ago. This is pre-pandemic. He was talking about access to healthcare in our rural communities. And one of his through lines in that, one of the things that he said was really important was having access to the internet, was bringing the internet to people. Right. So they had access to telemedicine. Little did we know in 2020, all of us would need access to that in various ways in the most important way possible, right? Because we couldn't physically get to the doctor in a lot of cases, but we needed that care. And so telemedicine became really important. Additionally, with rural broadband expansion, we learned during the pandemic, during 2020, that students need access to reliable and good high-speed internet where they can stream lessons, where they can log on, where they can be engaged in their classrooms from home. We learned how important that is for our community. And what I'm afraid that we're seeing with the STAR testing results that have come out now, and which was forecast by people who are in the education agency, we knew there was going to be some educational consequences to the pandemic. With the STAR testing results, we're starting to see the baseline of how bad that is because students were less engaged when they were at home. And it's not their fault, and it's not their teacher's fault, and it's not their parents' fault. We were all going through a pandemic. We were all living through this once in a lifetime terrible thing. And of course, math and science weren't really important to us during that. They were, but just getting through the day was really important and dealing with that. And so I think that rural broadband and expanding that access is super important, especially during the pandemic, but moving forward as well as education changes and as we try and catch those students up to a positive academic environment and set them up for success in the future. Being in higher education, you know how important that is, that students have that firm foundation of those core educational issues, math, science, reading, all of those things are so important. And so if we can't catch our students up for that, I worry about the long tail effects of that. So I think that the broadband access HB5 is really super important in that way.
That's a really good. That's a good point for a couple of reasons. But I suppose that the one that strikes me the most is the fact that in life, like typically my experiences that I think of as the most formative, I don't realize in the moment. I always realize them later, and I guess that's just part of the growth process. And so, if I was 16 years old going through the pandemic. And I'm going to definitely have to use my imagination here because that was a long time ago. But I will say that if I were to go back in time and say I'm 16 years old and this pandemic is going on, I think that maybe when I was 22 or 23 and when I started back in school, maybe it would be an interesting entry point for me to go back into education or into higher ed if I was a senior. And look at the world maybe a little bit differently than I did before, understanding the impacts of outside events coming in and disrupting and interrupting my plans. Because when you're 16, your plans are pretty much to hang out with your friends if you have them. And if not, then to play guitar or get on stage or play football or, that dominates your life.
The extracurriculars are more important.
Oh,
sure.
yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's something,
for a lot of us.
Yeah, for a lot of us. Yeah. And then when we get to the other side of that, even if somebody was like enjoyed going to concerts or something like that, if you don't own a lot of land or someone likes to hunt, if you don't own a lot of land, you don't have access to some of those things. Right? No big deal. It's not a have or have not type of thing. It's just kind of, or maybe it is, but not one that we should fret over. It's a private property rights issue. But at the same time, it is one that can change and shape the way we evaluate and think about the world, and therefore maybe reprioritize the things that we really want out of life. So in the future, I imagine that we're going to have drastically robust public health surveillance system, which is going to require lots of internet. We're going to have some incredible young people going into the world of medicine, and right now there's a high demand for that, but less so into the standard medical practice world of doctors, and more into the technocrats or bureaucrats of doctors, like an epidemic intelligence service officer with the CDC or something like that. And maybe those would be the more robust things. But anyway, I mean, it is interesting because all of those jobs require really good internet. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, if I remember, I mean, Representative Price was very much ahead and prescient with this. Not prescient. He didn't foreknow what was going on,
Certainly.
But he was ahead of the curve here, knowing what needed to happen. I think pretty much across the board with mental health issues.
Right.
But the other thing is that they all require really good access to internet, and we might complain about the internet, but I mean, if we don't have access to it, we are really in a position where we can't pay bills. We can't. Do a lot of things. And
think about, how that affects adults. And I don't want to spend the entire time that we have talking about the internet. But another point that I want to make about this is that when we think about rural broadband, I think about the Perrytons of the world and the Ochiltree counties and all of these kind of far and away places, far and away because we're in the Texas Panhandle, everything is kind of far and away. So you think about these kind of out of pocket places, these 2 hours to get to places from Amarillo. But really we have to consider as well that there are places in Amarillo city proper, that do not have good internet, that do not have access to reliable, high-speed internet, high-quality internet. And I think that's something that city leaders are looking at as we consider using the American Rescue Plan funds that we're getting and other funds from other places to expand that and to make sure that our students do have. Amarillo College is super involved in that because we recognize how important that is, not only for the places, far-flung places on the high plains, but for these the places that are in municipalities that also don't have reliable internet. During the thick of the pandemic, Amarillo ISD was like driving buses to places that served as a place where people could go and have internet. Here in the city, this is not something that's far and away from where we are. This is something happening in our own backyards, and I think Amarillo College, to be completely biased and completely a cheerleader for AC, is really focusing on that and bringing that technology to people in our community. And I'm glad that AC is focused on that, along with our other educational leaders in our community and city leaders as well.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So the first one that I did. So do you want to do it like this, or do you want to do back and forth like this?
Certainly.
Okay. Because I'll let you roll through this 5 thing. We can talk about yours all of them. It's not going to hurt my feelings.
No, I would love to. I want you.
Okay. I did the Porch to Plains, creation of the advisory committee, SB 1474. I think we have, I got online and moved and found this really great website just about the national level, this coalition alliance that is out there for the Porch to Plains, where, in Texas, we focus on Laredo pretty much all the way to North Panhandle, the Northern Panhandle. However, at the national level and the federal level, they look at this being something that will be segmented all the way up to the Canadian border. Mm-hmm. That's not Canadian Texas, the Canadian border. And it's going to go through the Dakotas, I believe, Colorado, and then eventually Nebraska, Montana. I'm sorry, maybe both. But it's an interesting concept because this is something that's been going on. It's not new, 5 years old or 6 years old. I'm sure they've been studying it for a lot longer than that, given what I've learned about the strategic vision of Amarillo and how long that has taken to come into fruition, and what we know about public policy, how long it takes to put together budgets and all those other things. Prepare people, demonstrate needs, all those things that you need to do whenever you're really putting together a good plan. But, I-27, how useful is that going to be, expansion of I-27?
So in our reporting about the Porch to Plains, a couple of really interesting points about that. I'm glad that you brought this up because it is so important to our area. And it's something that I don't know that if you are not involved in, transportation or economy, or specifically, commerce, like you probably haven't considered how important that is. But it is so, so important. And people have been talking about legislators and city planners and municipalities and state leaders and all, have been talking about Porch to Plains since the 90s. This has been happening for years, nearly 30 years we've been talking about Porch to Plains. So this advisory committee coming out of this legislative session is certainly a step in the direction of expanding I-27 and completing that project after all these years. So I'm super excited about that. It's so important to our area, not only Amarillo, but also Lubbock and all of the towns that I-27 will hit along the way. Expanding I-27 means that bigger, larger sort of freight can be transported, which means more trucks will be on our roads, which means more people will be driving through our city, which means more people are stopping and spending money, right? And hanging out maybe for the night, maybe longer, and spending that money and putting money into our coffers as far as hotel occupancy tax and others go, and using those roads and bridges and the infrastructure that we have to support the Porch to Plains. So this is why it's taking like 30 years to do, because there are so many things to think about and so much collaboration from not only cities, counties, you've got state and federal agencies that all have to work together on this. But if this can be done, and the advisory committee is going to start meeting before the end of the year, but has not been named yet. They have not decided exactly who will be involved in that, but you can imagine that it'll be somebody, the city manager, maybe a mayor from Lubbock, legislators from that area, legislators from our area, city manager, mayor, all people, who will be involved in this, taking all of those things into consideration and offering their advice.
Did you head this? Were you a project leader here because you just named off the people that were actually going to be on this sucker. And I mean, it is going to be the city managers, or like they can have, someone who it's not going to be probably a legislator, but they're going to be listening very closely to what they have to say, mayoral perspectives on that stuff. And they have them designated by county all the way down. It's going to be really interesting. I want to hear I was looking forward to hearing some of the things on the creation of this, the Committee on Mass Violence and what they were planning on doing. However, this would also be a really interesting public hearing thing because I want to hear all of the agribusiness people coming out and talking about what it is what are their interests in this, what are the energy interests in this. I wonder about the potential for a pipeline, some of the other potentialities because of the some things that are going on in the country, the Keystone pipeline and some other things that have been held up, and what's going on in Europe. So we have. I mean, Texas is a great state.
I agree with that.
I love this state, man. Like we can hammer out everything, and I love the fact that also it can be troublesome, but we also, even though we meet once every 2 years, it allows us to take a look at the policies that we're putting into place and not have too short-sighted of a vision of it and still come back long enough. It can be frustrating though, right? I mean, it takes time to gather data. And we're both students also. Not just of the news, but I try to be less of a student of the news, no offense, and more a student of like the data, so to speak.
Why, yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, that is absolutely important to what legislators do. And I think it's why they have such in my mind, an enviable position when they have staffers that can walk down and produce these reports and do research for them all the time. I would be the biggest nerd ever in the history of
congressional staffers.
Of congressional staffers. I mean, even at the national level, having access to CRS. I mean, they're great professionals, no doubt about it. But their whole existence is to research cool stuff and sometimes not so cool stuff, because somebody asked them to.
And so important. That job is so important. And I think that we've discovered, when you talk about these issues, and certainly our legislators know that because they rely on those documents and research that those people have done. So important to be the person who can get into the weeds on these things and to figure those things out. The last thing that I want to say about Ports to Plains, Aaron, is that I consider when we're talking about commerce and the importance of commerce through our area, through the High Plains particularly, I think about the origins of our city. Think about cattle drives. Think about why Amarillo was so important. When we got the railroad, it made the town. This is why Ports to Plains is so important. This is the modern day, railway that we are able to access that commerce. And maybe that's a bit of a leap, but I think it's super important for our city, and the economic implications are massive.
Right. Great summation. It's what's next?
So next for me, we've kind of talked about the social justice movement. We've kind of talked about those type of things. And I think that really ties into the next two topics that the governor said were some of his the things that he was bragging about after the session ended. And I think that's expanding Second Amendment rights, and I think it's supporting our police force, right? So with the Black Lives Matter movement, and after George Floyd was killed, and the trial that went on this year, and the conviction and the sentencing that has just happened as well, this has been top of mind throughout the pandemic. It is incredible to me to look back at the past 2 years and to consider the staying power of that movement throughout, against all odds of having the pandemic happening, where we weren't, recommended to gather in large crowds, but the Black Lives Matter movement was still so present during that and did not give up. And so, not saying good one way or the other, but saying that it's incredible to look at an organization that can be that relevant during a global pandemic where we're all, freaking out about other things. So just the fact that they were still around is super important. But I think that kind of translated into the legislative session through those things, right? Because we had cities like Houston and Austin talking about answering the call to defund the police. That was the big call in some points during that movement, the conversation surrounding our police force and policing our police force and making sure that people are safe and that our police force is not using excessive force and is not, and are held account for what they're doing to people, as we saw in with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. And so that was kind of the impetus of these expanding Second Amendment rights and supporting our police, as the governor has put forward, because what several pieces of legislation ultimately did was say, no, Austin, no, Houston, you guys are above 250,000 people and you cannot remove funding from the police, or you'll face these penalties from the state. So the more liberal, maybe, cities in our state were considering that, and the legislature stepped in and said, no, you will not do that. You will not defund the police force in Texas. So I thought that was really interesting.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. When we're always having this debate about the legislature and rural and urban areas. Mm-hmm. I think this is probably one of the more superficial things that we talk about when we talk about representation in Texas. Mm-hmm. It's still really important east of I-35 and the urban triangle and all those different things that we talk about a lot, but I'm curious, about the relevance of certain things, like, for instance, I agree that was a push to say, no, some of the more progressive and liberal people of living in some of those areas mm-hmm. Might say this is not a good way to run this state, right? And yet it's also kind of a safeguard, right, to prevent part of the population from maybe saying something about some of the more rural parts of those same communities. So what I mean is, when I say that, a city outside of Round Rock, for example, just to kind of create a straw man, and I do that once every episode. I've got to create at least one straw man. I know you can't do that so much on the news, or you're asked not to, but I do it on this podcast all the time. I remember presidents are great at doing this, by the way. I'm not saying I should be president. That would be a bad idea. But but I do like to do it on this podcast. But so just create a straw man there. If you have some folks out there in the middle of a rural area, 15 miles outside of Round Rock, and which sits outside of this major cosmopolitan area. I don't know if is Austin a cosmopolitan city?
I think it would like to be.
I think it would like to be. And if it aspires to be, then good for it. It's like being in Hollywood, trying to work your way up, but there's a million actors out there. So
true.
I get you. So if that's true, would this also be kind of another way to check the government? To give that kind of power to the different institutions, the executive branch and the legislative branch. We won't go there. That's out of state.
Yeah.
I had another issue on my mind.
I think that's true. I think that this is it's an interesting, and considering that the more conservative legislators that we have are often run on platforms of small government. This would seem to me to not be a small government action. This is literally telling municipalities what they can and cannot do when it comes to their police force, which is interesting. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just an observation that is what this is. So it's an interesting decision on the part of the legislature and on the legislature, and an interesting decision on the part of the governor as well.
Right. And we also had the governor kind of striking back and kind of cutting back on some funds for congressional staffing as well, which was...
Oh, yeah. I definitely want to talk about that because I think that is a fascinating thing that happened with... So our legislature, the body, right, the Senate and the House, they have to pass, they are mandated that they will pass a budget during the legislative session, during every legislative session. And so often when we get through the legislative session, one of the things, the first thing that you hear out of every politician's mouth, again, not saying this is good or bad, this is just, I've been reporting on politics for a long time, is we passed the most balanced budget we have ever passed. That is probably true every time. This time, that is not what you're hearing from our legislators because they're going back into a special session because they have to continue to talk about the budget because the governor vetoed, he has line item veto. So he can go through the budget and say, this is bad. We're taking this out immediately. We are not going to do this and we are not going to do that. He gets to go through that. That's his prerogative. And what he did was take away money for essentially legislative staffers. Sorry, guys, you're the ones who are doing that research like we were so excited about earlier. Like, we're so fascinated by, Aaron and I both are. But, pretty much said, yeah, that's we're not going to do that. And so when he called a special session, which is happening starting July 8th, is that when they go back?
Yeah, it's coming up very quick.
When they that's one of the things that they have to talk about. So you haven't heard people talk about the budget because that's something that they still have to iron out.
It'll be an interesting case. And I've read that in the Tribune that there are other issues that could come up in that special session that maybe are kind of grenades to lob over and just kind of waiting, particularly being in the summer now. At the very beginning of the session, I remember, and during the interim year, we're lucky that that COVID in some ways hit during the interim year. Maybe we're not. But it hit during the interim year, which is the year that legislators typically use to evaluate what their legislative agendas are going to be in the upcoming session.
And campaign.
That's right. Yeah, they like to campaign.
A lot of campaigning.
Yeah, lots of campaigning. And we also had a new Speaker of the House.
Dave Phelan.
Yes, and his rise in many ways might be attributed to to Bonin, Secretary or Speaker Bonin's really weird exit. It
was so odd. So, and I know that you're about to talk more about this, and I want to let you do that. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, speak.
But I think that Speaker Bonin, and when he left, so Bonin was in the previous legislative session. He was a one-term Speaker of the House. This is very rare for the state of Texas. Often we have speakers who will sit in that chair for terms at a time, for very, very long term. So when Bonin came around, and you'll remember For Price, who we've talked about a lot, was in the mix to be Speaker during the 86th legislative session. He made a good run at it. And I think there were, I don't want to speak to exactly maybe what happened that he didn't get that nod, but For Price has been, he's been a very influential person in the Texas House of Representatives. He is able to draw a lot of people together. He's able to build consensus, and so I think he was thought of as not the heir apparent, but certainly someone who could do that job. That would have been huge for our area. Having the Speaker of the House be someone from here on the High Plains would be a massive get, because your issues then are the issues that your area faces and that your constituents are in your ear about, maybe get more play in the legislative session. That's the thought behind all of this. But Dennis Bonin was elected Speaker, and he was a one-term Speaker, and he got caught on tape saying untoward things to a blogger. I'm not going to call him a reporter.
Okay.
But they run a website that has a definite slant, has a definite political agenda, right? And so it's hard for me to call them a journalist, because journalists don't do that.
Are we talking about TPPF, the Texas Public Policy Foundation?
No, no.
Okay.
But they also obviously have a slant.
Okay. Okay. I'm on a different page. Talk to me about the journalist and the blogger, because I thought for some reason this had to do, in some ways, he was secretly recorded by one of whoever runs this. I think we can both kind of get together on the fact that this is a very conservative leaning policy foundation.
Right. Yes. So maybe it is. I was thinking it was something else, but I think it is the Texas TPPF. I think you're correct about that. So
I might not be.
so we'll have to fact check it. We'll put our interns on it to fact check it. So so he gets caught on tape saying some things that are untoward, making some jokes that are off color, and then those tapes are released, and he doesn't recover from that. So Bonin not only resigns his position as a member of the Texas House, he also then resigns from being Speaker. Now, if you consider in the previous legislative session, in the 86, there were thoughts, there were considerations, and there were talks about an additional special session because of gun rights issues that our state was facing, because we were in the wake of mass shooting after mass shooting. And the one in Santa Fe, I think, was formative for a lot of our legislators to consider this can and does happen here, and so there was a lot of pressure to maybe call a special session and to deal with that. And I think the Committee on Mass Violence came out of that. But there was a lot of pressure for that. But without a head of the House, without a person who is Speaker, who is in good standing, who can lead and build consensus, that did not happen last time. So Bonin's out. Feeling comes in this session. For Price was interested. He talked to me a little bit about that on the record, about putting out feelers to see if maybe this would be his legislative session to make a run at House Speaker again. It didn't work out that way again. Dade Phelan is the Speaker of the House, and it's just so fascinating to watch the long tail effects of having an upset like not having a speaker at the end of that legislative session, and what that's done for what that did in the 87th, and what that might continue to do in the special session that's been called.
Yeah, I mean, and especially with For Price being such a massive advocate for public health, access to health. He would have been such a natural fit. Kind of makes you wonder whether or not people wish, the wish factor. On the other hand, it's always healthy to have in the news, or to project an image in the news about this contention going on between the lieutenant governor in the Senate and the Speaker of the House in Texas, because they're the one, if they don't want to get run over by the executive branch, it's the one body that can stand up to them. And that's interesting in itself. And so I wonder what the consensus is, or what the hostility or the contentious issues between Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Phelan really are, and whether or not that's part of the campaign, right? Mm-hmm. It's a media campaign, and I mean, it's interesting. So I guess we'll have to see
the power dynamics of the Texas legislature.
Yeah, it never ends. They called that scandal, by the way, the Speaker and the Creeper.
Oh.
Anyway, I just found that in the Times. Okay, so what's another one that you had?
So I think maybe that talking about the Committee on Mass Violence is an interesting segue into talking about gun rights and talking about Second Amendment rights, something, again, that the governor touted as a legislative success in the 87th session, saying expanding our Second Amendment rights was one of his goals and one of the things that he's proud of, which I think is interesting, because we've seen over the past few sessions, and I don't want to talk about the past few sessions too much, but continually, as a state, our access to and our ability to carry guns and carry them in the open, and all weapons in the open, and those kind of things have changed in the past couple of sessions, have expanded. And this session is no different. Now the licensing around weapons, guns, has changed dramatically, or will change when laws go into effect are enacted on September 1st. But will change in that way. And I think that's an interesting response to the thing that our nation is dealing with generally, which is we do have mass shootings every week as a nation. We just do. It's just part of what happens in the United States. That's not saying one way or another. That's just the statistics on it show us that this is happening. Mass shootings being 6 or more people are killed. And that does happen. And so it's an interesting answer to that, to say more people with less training, which is what will be achieved by the legislation that will be enacted here in the state. More people will have guns with less training surrounding them as well. And it's an interesting answer to reckoning with the mass shootings that we deal with as a nation.
Okay. So without asking whether or not it's good judgment to do that, I mean, they're kind of expanding some access to firearms. And there were other bills that were out there that seemed to try to address some of the issues that were being talked about and discussed by the Mass Violence Committee that was touring the state of Texas.
Amy Presley to Tabitha's office if you're free, Amy Presley.
Hey, well, that was the lords of the Panhandle PBS FM 90 studios. Amy Hart has been summoned. Check out her podcast. Check me out, a podcast for book lovers. Okay, we're back on Life in Bomb City. Okay, so the next thing that we were visiting about when we got cut off by that commercial was the Mass Violence Committee, the Committee on Mass Violence, that was touring the state of Texas and going from big city to big city or city to city and trying to visit with people about what they could do to help solve these and resolve these issues. One of the things that you just brought up was that there has been an expansion of access to firearms by people who typically in the past have relied on concealed and carry permits. And we've seen that as kind of popularly known as constitutional carry. I'm curious to know, like, some of the more the mental health aspects of those. Not so much in the hands of not addressing that policy specifically, but rather addressing it as something that the Committee on Mass Violence was thinking about and tabling and discussing with communities about educating young people on what to look for when somebody looks like they want to commit an act of violence, or they want to maybe or potentially are thinking about committing suicide, what to look for when, and who to contact. I mean, it's not just, hey, 1-800-1888, suicide prevention or whatever the case may be, the hotline, but also where do you go and how do you do that? One of the things that came out of that conversation was this active shooter security alert system. And I think this is going to end up playing out effective September the 1st, that we'll have something on our phones that, not unlike the DPS
Amber
Alerts or the DPS, we have an officer that's been shot, and we are looking for the perpetrator. This will have up-to-date information about active shooter events. I believe it was notably named after the youngest person that was killed in Midland, Odessa, at that tragic event. But it also highlights the prevalent need and maybe some of the thinking demonstrated by what they were finding out about the red flags and about some of the other things that make people pray rather than informed about how to how to maneuver, how to think about getting out of those situations. And of course, we don't walk in thinking that that's the situation we're going to get in. We get into it, or we are in it and we don't realize it. And so maybe some of those allowances will save lives. I'm curious to know how far policy can go on that, and what limits. This is one of those questions that will live on in perpetuity in our country, which is, how far do you go while continuing to respect the rights of a group of people and citizens that are incredibly passionate about issues of personal property and preference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. How do we square as a nation? I think we're all reckoning with this. How do we square as a nation the Second Amendment, which obviously is a keystone of our democracy? It's something that, that we've built a lot of legislation around. How do we square that with the fact of these tragedies that are happening? Again, every week we're seeing these things. How do we square those things? And I don't envy our legislators for having to figure that out.
Right. It'll be interesting to find out. And I guess we'll probably find more of this in next year's interim. But there were a lot of things that got left out of, I think, some of the recommendations for that. And I think pandemic probably had a lot to do with that as well.
See, and I think going into the 87th legislative session, after the 86th, it was kind of like, we know what's going to happen in the 87th. We know gun legislation is going to be the major topic. And then we had a global pandemic that threw everything off kilter, and so those issues are still relevant and still something that we have to deal with, that we maybe didn't get to implement, that we didn't get to pay as much attention to during this legislative session as we would have without the pandemic. The pandemic just messed everything up as far as, what the goals were in this session, I think.
Yeah. I hate you, COVID-19.
Yeah, seriously.
That was something that I think we can all, I don't know if that hashtag, it was do you remember the Thanks Obama hashtag?
Yes.
Do you remember that? I mean, they were the chief scapegoat. Well, that was not necessarily, maybe it was the president and COVID. And who knows what? Give me a break.
But us sitting here in 2021 in July, 5 feet from each other without masks on. Thank you, science. Here we are.
Yeah,
we're getting through.
Yeah, there you go. We had a major energy event, an electricity event. Did you have anything on that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I definitely want to talk about that, because I think that there's a lot of confusion among my viewers and among people who are maybe paying attention to this adjacently and not, complete and total wonks like you and I are, and dealing with all of this every day and considering, all of these implications of this legislation. But that became a goal of the governor at the beginning-ish, first few weeks of this session, because the state had this massive energy crisis where hundreds of people died, very sadly, because we had this massive cold front come through, Arctic air that lasted the 5-ish days, and people were without power, and they were trying to warm themselves in a lot of different ways that were not healthy. And unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives because of this. So the governor's response to that was, this is now a legislative priority, and we are going to figure out how to fix ERCOT, right? And here in the Texas Panhandle, most of us are not on ERCOT. Most of us did not lose power for a sustained amount of time like our friends in South Texas did. I have family who live in Abilene and that area, and their experience was drastically different than my experience during that. I lost power like twice for like 45 minutes, and they were losing power for days at a time. And it's a massive difference, and they're right down the road. But so the High Plains, most of us here were on the Southwest Power Pool and not on ERCOT. And so for us to say, yeah, it was cold and that was kind of a bummer, but it's so important to the rest of our massive state that these legislative issues went through. And did anything come of it? Are there actual changes in policy that will keep that from happening again? I think that's an open question at this point.
Right. I mean, how often does an Arctic freeze happen in Texas? It doesn't happen very often.
Right.
On the other hand, maybe the weatherization issue of electricity production maybe was something that reform that needed to be taken place. I think they were taking the budget or some of the funds out of the rainy day fund, and I don't know if that's still happening or not. Do you have any idea? Okay,
I'm not sure how they're.
It's like $2 billion or something.
So we went into the session with the largest rainy day fund we've ever had, and so it wouldn't surprise me if they said, this is something that needs to happen. Where can we take that money from? And said, oh, look, we have this rainy day fund. We can borrow some of that to do this and keep people safe during an event like this and update our infrastructure. Everything is about infrastructure. We've talked about ports to planes. We've talked about, all of this stuff. It's so important. It sounds so boring, but these things are really matter, especially during events like what we had in February.
Right, and we have an engine that's helping out and propel this kind of seeming stagnant issue over the last 20 to 30 years, where we've seen our infrastructure kind of start to have some cracks and crannies in it. And this kind of really creates a demand and a need that's something that's that drives politicians to do things. It's based off that incentive system, which is unemployment. That being a major issue going in to this session as a result of some of the other issues created by the 2020 events. Maybe also will help out with the unemployment issues, but also creates this real demand for those types of things, including the weatherization and the electricity production. It also drives another complex issue. Like we need, and we're just scraping the surface of what policymakers do and decision makers at that level. It's real easy to snipe, as they say on the West Wing, snipe on Meet the Press. But the more difficult thing to do is to sit down, evaluate why people are making some of the decisions they're making, and stop assuming that they're driven purely by incentives that are for their own gain. And sitting down and thinking, okay, well, if they say that this is not what I think it is, I want to listen to what they have to say. And taking the time, having the patience to listen to people and other people who are coming to them with problems. And that other complex issue is the issue of energy production and where that energy is coming from, because we had a national election and Texas is part of a federal system. We have funding that is not only from Texas, but also international agreements that the state of Texas cannot, from a sovereign perspective, deal with, needs the federal government to help it prop it up. In 2020, had a president that was very pro energy independence, and Texas being a major part of that plan, to the next year having that taken away again. And that sense of loss, maybe disempowerment, disenfranchisement, and the major issue of job insecurity that creates from natural gas and the oil industries just cannot be ignored. And so I'm very interested to see what ends up happening out of that, reliability being the main issue. And I see a lot of potential for conflict going on between the federal government and the state governments in the upcoming years. Not that we've had a lack of it in the past, but an increase in it over this idea of purely energy and what we do with oil and gas and liquefied natural gas being brought into the ports and put into our pipelines. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what comes of that engine, because around the Texas Panhandle, this is part of who we are. We can't have. I mean, if you talk to people in this business, they'll say that reliability is king. It's the standard
in oil and gas or in electricity.
Yeah, and all of it, yeah. Oil and gas are incredibly, they're two of the hallmarks of what I guess we would consider to be the raw materials needed to help the power plants generate the electricity that it then packages and sends out to the rest of the country. And whether it's renewables, and we've prided ourselves on being ahead of the curve. Rick Perry's 2020 initiative went above and beyond what we were expecting and what we had set as a goal for those renewable energies. But now that we have them, we're kind of starting to see some of the other issues that kind of co-occur with doing things ahead of time, which is that the cost and maintenance of those products, namely the windmills and turbines, and of course the solar panels taking hits and being insured. I have a feeling that this is just kind of the beginning of a new chapter, maybe. I think not in a very long book. So maybe Dostoevsky should have taken this one up.
I think you're right. I think that when people think that they want to go into local government or state government and they start to run for these offices, and they realize more than one person who has been newly elected has told me, on record and off record, it's like drinking out of a hose, like a fire hose, like figuring out how nuanced these issues are. Because you look at an issue and you're like, well, flip the switch back on. That is so not what this is, right? Because you look at it in a practical, non-political junkie sort of way, and you're like, fix it, just fix it. And it's so nuanced. There's so many other things that you have to consider when you consider those issues, and making sure that people have literally power that is saving lives, and making sure that people can survive through events like what we had in February. So it's a very high stakes sort of thing to consider. Not only are jobs super important, but also when you're considering moving natural gas, moving those products, going back to ports to planes, we've got to have the infrastructure in place to get those places, those things to places safely, and to not affect the environment along the way, and to not cause more harm to people who live in these communities where that stuff is passing through. So you've got to think about all of those things continually. It's so many layered issue that, again, I'll say this a couple of more times, I'm sure, during this podcast. I don't envy these legislators for having to think about all of those things all at once.
Man, but wow, if you're an intellectually curious person, this is the place, right?
It's true.
So do we want to talk about hospitals?
Absolutely.
By the way, to jump back real quick, Xcel Energy, got to give them a big shout out for the 2050 carbon-free initiative that they have set forth. Not carbon-free, carbon capture-free, really, initiative. As Wes Reeves pointed out to me, we're made of carbon, so we don't want it to be carbon-free. But that's one thing that I think we can go ahead and just kind of celebrate together as a community, that we have a very forward-looking energy company, and there's so many different other players and stakeholders in that decision-making process. But that's a fantastic thing, and they're thinking about reliability every single day. We have NERC, the National Electric Liability Commission, and ERCOT, and all these they're reliability concerned. And once again, it's easy to throw these rocks. But how often do some of these things happen, and do we want to fail safe it across the board, and create these maintenance costs that are going to be ongoing forever and ever and ever? It was kind of the question of the wall back in the day. 2016, right?
Still the question of the wall. How do we pay for this?
How are we going to pay for it, and how are we going to upkeep it? It wasn't so much even like the initial cost, but the upkeep over a period of 30 years. So anyway, all right. So if you like lower taxes, always be looking down the road. It's the Mothman prophecy stuff, But anyway, all right. Do we want to talk about exempting hospitals from lawsuits, SB 6?
I think absolutely.
Okay. What would you like to say about it?
I just think it's a fascinating, what I'll say is, obviously, during the pandemic, we all had a new appreciation for our healthcare heroes, and deservedly so. People on the front lines, certainly of hospitals, not only doctors, nurses, researchers, respiratory techs, but janitors and people who were, at every single level of our healthcare system, showed how important they are. And so that's what I want to say about our hospitals and how important they are, especially here in Amarillo. They're one of our top employers for our region. We have a robust medical community, and I don't think it's political of me to say that they did an incredible job during 2020, and they worked so hard, and all of the praise and all of the bonuses and all of the food that was given to them and every single thing is well-deserved for all of those people. And they came together in a really incredible way during the pandemic to help us through it. And I am constantly in awe of our medical community. And so I think that this topic is an interesting sort of divergence from that in a way.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of we had and we saw this after some other major national. I think we could call healthcare certainly it falls within the realm of national security. Mm-hmm. I think there's no question about the fact that the potential for a bug to disrupt and dismantle the whole economy, the shutting it down for prolonged periods of time, the unknowing of, and I think this was the big thing with COVID was we were waiting for information for a long time. And of course, science takes time. So good science takes time. Bad science you can kind of make up as you go, or weird science particularly. But that movie did not end with the way that those two guys thought it was going to. However, it does create kind of this other looming question about, can we get so laser focused on accomplishing and dealing with one issue? And we saw this after 9/11, that some of the other issues kind of have to go by the wayside. We recently saw the passing of Donald Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense. Rest in peace. And oversaw the transformation of the United States military from not just being this mammoth, hard to mobilize group, but more of an expeditionary nature and very fast and lethal. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. I'm not equating the two, right? One is...
You're not militarizing hospitals.
No, and probably shouldn't be done. But at the same time, it asks an interesting question, I think. I think it demands us to at least consider and think about what comes next for hospitals. And they're kind of thinking down the line of what exactly could be some of the unintended consequences of being so laser focused on one issue and getting as much information as we can so we can save as many lives as we can. What did we miss during this period where all of us were mobilized for one other mission? So this SB 6 kind of does some things for exempting hospitals from lawsuits as long as they were acting in good faith during the pandemic. It's a major, probably I think it would be understating things to say this is a very important piece of legislation for healthcare workers and for these really big hospitals in every metro area that dealt with this on a major level and saw surges.
I think it's also interesting to consider, from a national security standpoint, like you said, statistically, more people were using healthcare services during the pandemic. More of us were sick, more of us needed it, and so more of our information was being stored in various places. Well, that made us vulnerable to attacks. And it happened. Major hospitals were hacked. Hospitals here in Amarillo were hacked, and all of their information, their patient database, was locked down at some point. And we had to go back to our nurses and doctors had to go back to charting by hand, which has not happened in a long, long time. There are generations of nurses who have not ever done that, who were telling me that they had to try and do that and like figure it out along the way. But that was what became, one of the safer ways to keep everybody on the same page, literally on the same page, by having a page, and going back to that and reverting back to that kind of old style of doing things. And so then that information is more at risk for some, and I'm not saying that this happened. I have no reports of this happening. We have not reported on this at all. But when you have a paper trail of somebody's health information, then that opens you up to risk in that way, as an old school risk of, somebody turning that page over and learning things about patients that maybe are not public knowledge. Or where does that paper go after, obviously it's shredded, it's taken care of, there are responsible people in the healthcare field who are making sure that that information is safeguarded. But all of that information being online does open us up to that sort of attack. And so interesting to think in those terms of, we have more information about people in our healthcare system, housed in servers around the world, and here in Amarillo and here in Texas. And so how do we keep that safe? And is HB6 a part of doing that, to make sure that hospitals are empowered to make those decisions, those snap judgments that they need to make to treat their patients the best that they can, to literally save lives? And that's, I think, one of the goals was of HB6.
So EHRs, or electronic health records, and I remember the HITECH Act of 2009 taking place, particularly when it happened to be going on at the same time that we were having a national discussion about the Affordable Care Act. So it kind of went by without people being like really knowledgeable of the full ramifications of it. Now, I mean, we've made the transition since 2009. They phased it out, I think over a period of 6 to 8 years. I think it may have been 6 years, but there were penalties up until a certain point. And now healthcare providers do have to create these electronic health records. As you said, those paper records, as much as we don't like trusting electronic transmission, it can be even more problematic, perhaps, for identity theft reasons and other things. It's one thing, and this is going to sound really strange, because it speaks to a place of ignorance. And I want to make clear that I'm speaking from a place of ignorance when I say this. I don't know what foreign countries do with our information when they acquire it. When they get these big acquisitions of passwords, or the health status of the big dearths of our population, I think we have a better idea and can speculate a little bit more specifically when we think about, swiping your credit card at, Best Buy, and somebody like going click with your camera and clicking it, and finding out what the card is, and, maybe the security thing on the back, whether or not that's something that we deal with. And then, you see those purchases on Amazon that are outrageous, made by somebody, across the country. If you traveled recently, things like that. But what are the accountability standards, and how do we deal with those when some of the transmission goes over state lines? Because it then becomes a federal issue, and the limits. So to give an example, my son got sick we were in Missouri, and our son got sick, and oh my gosh, we went in, and they were able to pull his health record up, boom, immediately. It was incredible. I didn't think that it was going to be as wonderful as it was. I'm kind of a skeptic of anything that expands anything at first, But I think I'm a cynic. Is it okay to say that?
You live in the world of politics, aren't we all?
Right, that's true. But anyway, it's just kind of a sad thing to have to say. I'm very cynical and untrusting, but at the same time, that doctor was able to pull that record up immediately. It was very handy, not unlike your iPhone. On the other hand, we were in another state, and she pulled it up, like his whole medical record right then and there. She started just spouting off all these medical facts about him, and we were like, wow. that's incredible. That's just sitting out there. And, that was the big kind of one of the detractors. And of course, medical professionals, I think by and large, were highly supportive of the HITECH Act of 2009. It does so many things to make things more efficient. And anything that makes things more efficient, particularly in a competitive system, in a free market, we should probably get behind, because it's, that's how the free market works, is efficiency. On the other hand, we do have this other thing about security. And if you can't secure it, what do you do with it? So yeah, we did. We had some hacking that went on during this period of time. It's not new. We know that we have we have facilities all over our country that are hacked constantly, and there's always the potential on any given day, at any given hour, that there's going to be some type of a breach. And people are always prodding for weaknesses. I mean, foreign actors from all over the world, including states that are allies, or states that we consider to share interests with us. So that's an interesting thing, without going into more detail and speculating about what happens with our data once it's done. Is there a collection of information? I mean, we're not going to go and, I don't think anyway. Typically the DoD responds and the Department of State responds to things like that, not individual private citizens. And I think we had people like Dan Crenshaw in the U.S. Congress who was trying to introduce legislation that would allow Americans to sue the Chinese Communist Party for hiding some of these things and allowing us to prepare at the very, very beginning. I don't know how far any of that stuff will go. Maybe it's time for you to talk. Go.
I will cap all of that off. I think that particularly surveillance, particularly those sort of data gathering practices that nations engage in, all nations engage in one way or another. You asked, I don't know what happens with your information when this information becomes available to somewhere, when it becomes available to another state or entity or nation. Knowledge is power, right? And so when you can find things about people who live in a certain place, a certain area, having that knowledge can take you down a lot of different rabbit holes in your head about all the terrible things that can happen about that. So yes, protect your information, update your password. If you haven't done that lately, that would be my advice on all of that.
Yes, for sure. So that's pretty much all we're going to talk about today. I think we could talk about this fairly 5-6 hours, maybe longer than that.
I mean, if legislators couldn't talk about all of this and get all of this done in their regular session, so much so that they have to have a special session, we could talk about it for certainly at least that long.
Right. So, okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and visiting with us about some of the different issues surrounding the 87th Texas Legislature. Hoping that in a couple of years, when we're dealing with the 88th, you will be willing to come back on again and do a little debrief again. And so thank you so much for everybody tuning in and listening. Appreciate it. And Beth should be back next time. Thank you.